Prince William walked into a radio station, sat down with the hosts at Hard FM, and ended up in a full-blown argument about scones. Not palace politics, not royal duty, scones. Specifically, the question that has genuinely divided Britain for decades. Does the cream go on first, or does the jam go on first? And look, if you're not British, this might sound like the most low-stakes debate you've ever heard of. But over there, people have actual opinions about this. Strong ones, regional ones, grandmother endorsed ones. The Cornish say jam first, then cream. The Devonians say cream first, then jam. And nobody is budging. So William is sitting there on Hard FM, and the hosts ask him where he stands. And he doesn't dodge it, he just says it. Queen Elizabeth always put the cream on first. Said it with this casual confidence, like he was citing the most unquestionable authority in the room. Which, honestly, he kind of was. The late Queen's scone preference is not an argument anyone can really come back from. And yet the hosts went for it anyway. Trays of scones came out. Everyone started talking over each other. William was laughing throughout, not the polished, managed kind of laugh you see at official engagements. Just genuinely cracking up, having a good time. The whole clip had this energy of a person who is completely comfortable and not thinking about how they're coming across at all. And that's exactly why it spread. The clip went everywhere. British outlets picked it up, royal fan accounts reposted it, and then regular people who don't normally care about royal news were sharing it because it was just funny. William came across as a real person in that moment, not a future king managing a public image, just a guy laughing about jam and cream with radio hosts. That's rare, and people respond to it when it happens. Now here's where it gets interesting. Not long after William's scone moment was still making rounds online, still being discussed, still generating all this warm coverage, Meghan's As Ever brand posted content. And the content featured scones. Warm scones, jam, cream, a full British tea setting, beautiful lighting, very carefully put together, elegant, polished, clearly considered. The internet noticed immediately, and I mean immediately. Comment sections lit up. People started asking questions about the timing. Because scones are not some random everyday lifestyle staple that just happens to show up in content. Scones had just been attached very visibly to a major, widely shared, genuinely positive William moment. And then, as ever, posts scones. Same cultural reference, same British tea aesthetic, different energy entirely. Now, was it deliberate? That's the question everyone was arguing about. And honestly, I think the more important question isn't even about intent, it's about what the side-by-side comparison reveals. Because the contrast between these two pieces of content tells you something real about where both of these public presences actually are right now. William's scone clip worked because it wasn't trying to work. He wasn't doing a segment about relatability. He wasn't there to signal warmth to an audience. He was just having fun on a radio show, and it happened to be filmed. That's the difference between a moment and a production. The As Ever Scone post was a production. Beautiful, sure. Well executed, obviously, but you can see the intention in it. The lighting tells you someone made a choice. The arrangement tells you someone styled it. That's what a lifestyle brand does. And that's completely fine, but it lands differently than a man laughing with radio hosts about his grandmother's cream preference. And that same week, William had another moment. Aston Villa won their match, and William, who has been a Villa supporter for years, this is not new, this is genuine, was in the stands celebrating with everyone else. He was filming the crowd cheering, completely absorbed in it. And then his phone rang, he looked at it, dismissed the call without answering, and went straight back to celebrating. 3 seconds of footage. That's it. That 3-second moment became its own viral story, completely separate from the match. Comment sections went into full creative mode about who could possibly be calling the future king in the middle of a Villa win, and why it apparently wasn't worth picking up. The memes were everywhere. And again, William had no idea any of this was going to happen. He wasn't performing a relatable moment for social media. He was at football, his team won, and he wasn't picking up his phone. That's it. That's the whole thing. But when you put that next to the As Ever Scone content in the same week, the contrast just sits there and stares at you. One person is getting caught living their life. The other is constructing a version of a life for an audience to receive. Neither of those is a moral failing, but they communicate completely differently, and people feel the difference even when they can't quite name it. Continue. Here's the thing about as ever, though, this scone moment wasn't a one off. If you've been paying attention to the brand over the past several months, there's a pattern, and the pattern is this. The content that generates the most discussion, the most engagement, the most coverage is almost always the content that has some connection to the royal world, not the product itself, not the recipes, not the lifestyle aesthetic on its own terms. The moments that spread are the ones where there's a royal thread somewhere in it that people can pull on. And that's a genuinely uncomfortable observation for a brand that was built on the premise of independence. Because the whole story of 2020, the whole narrative around Harry and Meghan leaving, was about building something new, something that didn't need the institution, something that stood on its own. That was the pitch. California, freedom, their own terms, their own platform, their own identity, completely separate from the royal world they were stepping back from. 5 years later, the brand's biggest coverage spikes keep happening when it's closest to that world. The scone post landed in the middle of William's scone moment. Previous as ever content cycles have generated the most noise when royal comparisons enter the conversation. The British imagery that keeps showing up, the fine china, the candlelit tea settings, the cream and jam arrangements, that whole visual register is one that the public has spent decades associating with a very specific world. And it's not a world based in Montecito. Angela Levin, who has spent years covering the royal family and the Sussex story specifically, made this point directly in her commentary around the scone moment. Her argument, which she's been making across multiple contexts for a while now, is that the return to this kind of British prestige imagery isn't random. She's argued that Meghan found the royal hierarchy genuinely difficult to navigate. Specifically, the part where Catherine, as the wife of the heir, was always going to occupy a formally senior position regardless of individual celebrity, public profile, or media footprint. That wasn't negotiable. It wasn't determined by who was more popular or who had a bigger audience. It was determined by birth order and succession, and nothing Meghan did was going to change it. William and Catherine were the senior couple. Harry and Meghan were the junior couple. Full stop. And Levin's read is that this reality was a source of genuine tension, and that you can see traces of it in the ongoing pull toward imagery and aesthetics that are associated with that senior world. Now, whether you buy that psychological reading or not is completely up to you. You don't actually need it to see what's observable on the surface. The surface observation is simply that the brand keeps returning to a visual register that feels connected to British aristocratic and royal culture. And critics are going to keep pointing that out every single time it happens, especially when the timing lines up the way it did with the scone post. There's also a privacy angle here that's worth talking about because it came up in the same period. Some of As Ever's promotional content around this time included casual references to family members' preferences. What flavors different people in the household like, what the table looks like on a regular weekend, that kind of thing. And immediately people started asking the obvious question. This is a household that has very publicly, very consistently emphasized privacy, especially around the children. That's been a cornerstone of the public messaging for years. So when personal family details start appearing in commercial product promotion, it creates a tension that people are going to notice. Supporters will say, and they're not wrong, that mentioning what jam flavor someone in your house prefers is not a privacy violation. It's a normal humanizing detail in lifestyle content. But the problem isn't whether any single detail crosses a line. The problem is structural. You cannot simultaneously run a lifestyle brand, which is by definition built on selective personal disclosure, and claim total privacy as a principle. Those two things don't fully coexist. A lifestyle brand works by showing enough of a life to make that life feel aspirational and worth following. Every time a personal detail appears in that content, it reopens the question of where the line is and whether that line is consistent or just moves based on what's being promoted at the time. There was also the Memorial Day timing that critics flagged. The scone content dropped during an American holiday weekend when most Americans were at barbecues and outdoor gatherings, not British tea settings. The aesthetic mismatch between the holiday context and the content's visual register was noticed. Whether that's a strategic miscalculation or just a scheduling thing nobody thought too hard about, I genuinely don't know. But it added one more layer to an already busy conversation. What all of this adds up to, the scone timing, the visual register, the privacy tension, the Memorial Day mismatch, is a brand that is still being defined more by its relationship to the royal story than by anything it's doing on entirely its own terms. Continue? And that's the real issue, not the scones specifically, not whether Meghan saw William's clip and made a deliberate call to post something similar. The real issue is structural. A brand that was supposed to generate its own cultural momentum is still getting its biggest moments from proximity to a story it was supposed to have left behind. That's not a personality critique. That's just a business observation. Think about what it would look like if As Ever had genuinely arrived at independence. You'd see content dropping and creating its own wave, people talking about the product, the aesthetic, the brand identity on its own terms. The coverage would be about what As Ever is, not about how it relates to William or Catherine or the royal family. That's what brand independence actually looks like. And the Scone week showed pretty clearly that As Ever isn't there yet. The most discussed element of that Scone post wasn't the scones. It was the timing relative to William. There are two ways to read that pattern, and honestly, both of them are probably partly true at the same time. The first reading is that the brand genuinely needs royal adjacency to generate sustained engagement. That the audience most reliably drawn to As Ever content is the audience already invested in the broader Sussex and royal narrative, and that the brand has, consciously or not, calibrated itself toward that audience because that's where the attention is. The second reading is that this is largely a media creation. That any lifestyle content Meghan puts out is going to get filtered through a royal lens by commentators who are professionally focused on that world. And that the pattern exists partly because of how the coverage works rather than because of what the brand is actually doing. Both things can be true simultaneously. The honest answer is that from outside the operation, you can't fully separate them. But what you can observe is the pattern, and the pattern is consistent enough across enough months that it's hard to wave away. Here's what makes William's side of this week so interesting in contrast. William generated two separate viral moments in the same week, the Hard FM Scones segment and the Aston Villa phone call. And both of them happened because he was just doing things. He went on a radio show and talked about his grandmother's cream preference. He went to watch his football team and dismissed a call when they won. Neither of those was a content strategy. Neither was designed. Both spread widely and generated genuinely warm coverage because they felt completely real. And the uncomfortable truth for the Sussex brand is that William, by doing absolutely nothing strategically, created the cultural context that the As Ever Scone post then needed to exist in to generate attention. He wasn't trying to benefit the brand or complicate it or do anything related to it. He was talking about jam. But that conversation became the water the As Ever content swam in that week. That dependency, needing William to accidentally create the moment so that proximity to it generates engagement, is not a position of independence. It's the opposite. Angela Levin's broader point lands hardest right here. She's argued for years that the departure was framed as liberation, but that the pull toward the imagery and the story of the institution never fully went away. And the Scone Week is a pretty clean illustration of what she means. 5 years after the step back, the brand's most discussed moment of the week was a Scone post that mattered primarily because of its relationship to what William did. The person who was supposed to have been left behind is still the one generating the gravity. What happens next is genuinely interesting to watch because As Ever is still relatively new and brands do take time to build independent momentum. It's not impossible that the next phase of content finds its own footing and starts generating cultural weather that doesn't require a royal adjacent context to sustain it. That could happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And the Scone Week didn't move things in that direction. William, for his part, is completely unaware that any of this analysis exists. He went to Hard FM, argued about cream and jam, laughed a lot, went to Villa, watched his team win, ignored a phone call, and went home. Somewhere in the process of him just living his life, he created a week's worth of content dynamics that the people watching the Sussex brand are still unpacking. That detail that the person generating the most significant reaction for the As Ever brand is the person doing the least to create it and the least aware it's happening is honestly the most revealing thing about where all of this stands right now. The scone debate, cream first or jam first, will keep going in Britain. It always does. But the more interesting debate this week wasn't about the order of condiments. It was about whether a brand built on independence has actually found it. And based on everything this week showed us, that question